Welcome to another broadcast of MindYourHealthcast.com. I may be smiling and I may have my rose-colored glasses on, but I have to tell you, if there's a time to take them off, tonight is the time. While I'm making this broadcast, I want to take them off and leave them off because the material that we're going to be covering is probably some of the most important information and material that I have presented so far. The implications are so far-reaching that it is just beyond what we can even imagine, because as a consequence of the subject, we're going to point out that we have now $1 trillion a year or more health bill, which isn't really health, it's a sickness bill, that is a consequence of some of the things that we're going to be talking about. And the title, if there is to be a title for what we're talking about, is called Merchants of Deception, the Pharmaceutical Industry. And hopefully by the time I am through with at least 2 broadcasts it's going to take to cover it, I don't know that we'll have to do 3, depending on how much of the foundation we can lay tonight. So I'm going to remove my rose-colored glasses because what I'm going to be talking about is really not very rosy. In fact, it's pretty sad that we have been actually deceived and conned into believing that one cannot live without drugs. Now, way back, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was an MD and practiced medicine, not like today, but he had already observed something was happening. And I think it probably came as a result of him trying to have a political appointee doctor whom he felt was not adequate for the job removed. And because he was a political appointee, he was unsuccessful. And so he realized that already there was a problem developing, and from that problem has grown a major problem, and that is that when medicine aligned themselves with politics, they created something that has become a terrible monster, a giant dragon that has no limit to its appetite. It wants to devour everyone and everybody it can, and at a cost, a huge cost. So I'm going to read the statement that he made, and I'm going to read another more updated statement and lay the foundation for what we will be talking about. Okay, he said, unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organize into an undercover dictatorship to restrict the art of healing to one class of men and to deny equal privileges to others. The Constitution of the Republic should make a special privilege for medical freedom as well as religious freedom. Now that was said way back in the 1700s as they drafted the Declaration of Independence, and he penned his agreement that we should declare our independence from England. Now, if we fast forward, I'm going to be referring to a book, and we'll be referring to some other books. Now again, as I've said in all my previous broadcasts, I'm telling you my opinions based on my research and studies as a student of the history of medicine and pharmacy, as well as history in general. And some of the books that I'm going to refer to you are written by researchers and medical people, and getting those books, or at least getting them from a library or whatever, if you don't want to purchase them, and reading them could be one of the most enlightening reads that you've had in a long time. Now, the name of this particular book is called Selling Sickness by Ray Moynihan. The subtitle is How the World's Biggest Pharmaceutical Companies Are Turning Us All into Patients. Now, in the world today, you're probably going to run into very few people who are not, on an ongoing basis, taking anywhere from 1 or 2 to as high as 25 pharmaceutical drugs, many of those at the cost of several hundred, if not in some cases a couple of $1,000s per month, to take these drugs. And the reason they have done it is because an industry has grown that is, as I said, like a giant dragon or monster that devours everything in its way for big profits. Now, I'm not saying there's never a time for a drug in some unusual situation, but the wholesale making of people dependent on all of these drugs at such a tremendous cost has actually put a tremendous burden on our country, when there are other ways that are out there and that have been there all along that could be done at a fraction of the cost, either in terms of therapeutics, but behind that, preventatives. In other words, there are things that could be done to prevent the bulk of the illnesses that people are experiencing today, and it was very cleverly ignored and poo-pooed for years by the pharmaceutical industry. Now, the second statement I'm going to read you, you may not want to believe, but it's a fact. And as I say, you can get this gentleman's book and read for yourself. You don't have to take my word. And he has the references for his material, and he spent a long time researching all of this. Now, this book was written in 2005, and he's referring back to a statement made in 1975. And that statement may be shocking to some people, but I've known about all this for a long time, and I have alerted people to it, but for some reason, you know, it kind of falls on deaf ears. And I think the reason is because we have learned to believe the propaganda that's been put out by the pharmaceuticals to convince you that you should be taking their drugs. Okay, here's his statement. He says, 30 years ago, the head of one of the world's best-known drug companies made some very candid comments. Close to retirement at the time, Merck, which, as you well know, is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Merck's aggressive chief executive Henry Gadsden told Fortune magazine of his distress that the company's potential markets had been limited to sick people. Now, right off, to me, that's an interesting statement. Of course it would be limited to sick people if that's what they're making drugs for. However, what he said was, suggesting he'd rather Merck to be more like chewing gum maker Wrigley's, Gadsden said it had long been his dream to make drugs for healthy people, because then Merck would be able to sell to everyone. 3 decades on, the late Henry Gadsden's dream has come true. Now he says, again, this is the writer of the book, Moynihan. He said the marketing strategies of the world's biggest drug companies now aggressively target the healthy and well. The ups and downs of daily life have become mental disorders. Common complaints get transformed into frightening conditions, and more ordinary people are turned into patients. With promotional campaigns that exploit our deepest fears of death, decay, and disease, the $500 billion pharmaceutical industry is literally changing what it means to be human. Rightly rewarded for saving life and reducing suffering, the global drug giants are no longer content selling medicines only to the ill. Because, as Wall Street knows well, there's a lot of money to be made telling healthy people they're sick. Now he goes on later to say, yet for the relatively healthy people who are spread across the rest of the spectrum, a label and a drug may bring great inconvenience, enormous cost, and very real danger of becoming deadly, the sometimes deadly effects or side effects, what they call. Now I had an individual say before that calling it side effects is a way of playing down the dangerousness of all drugs. And there's a reason for that, because all of the drugs, almost without exception, that are on the market today are actually designed to shut off or control symptoms in the body and have nothing to do with making the person well. Now, some people would argue, well, gee, I take the drug and I feel better. Well, it's true, because where do the symptoms come from? The symptoms come from your immune system trying to make a correction. And I've said this before, but I'm wanting to bring it all together in these two broadcasts so that you really can get a grasp of the seriousness and the magnitude of the problem. Enormous costs and the danger of sometimes deadly side effects. Now, how many people die from drugs? It's been reported numbers somewhere in the realm of 130,000 to as high as 250,000 people die from wrong drugs, interaction of drugs, or just the adverse effects, period. And right at this point, we're not going to get into that aspect of it in any detail, but the drug companies know when they put a drug on the market, it has major effects. In order to shut down some function of the body, in order to mask a symptom, what happens? Well, of course, you have to cause other disturbances in the body too. And those other disturbances are not minor effects, they're major effects. So the drug industry very carefully chose the term side effects to sound like, well, you know, there's a few little adverse effects, but don't worry about that. As you need this drug, and this drug will make you feel better. And it's true. I don't disagree with that in any way, shape, or form, that the drugs do make you feel better because they turn off immune functions that don't always feel the best. As I have said before, remember the 4 marks of inflammation are redness, heat, swelling, and pain, and sometimes a 5th, which is fever. Those are all immune system response to your body attempting to get rid of something. For example, if you pick up a virus, your body will respond to that by setting in motion this response, the inflammatory response. And that is set in motion to get rid of the problem, neutralize it, and therefore be done with it. Now, the drugs will turn that off, and I think everybody agrees that that happens, but in so doing, it generates not only now adverse effects, which could in some cases be debilitating or even fatal, but at the same time, it will cause whatever the problem was to not be eliminated, which down the road will create a more serious problem, which in turn will generate a market to sell even more expensive drugs that will shut that down. What is the ultimate effect of all of this? Look around you. How many people do you know now that have chronic illnesses because not that they've caught some new thing that's chronic, because by nature chronic means something that's been around for a long time in a person, and that means that whatever was there did not get taken care of by the body's immune system, and now you come back with a more serious problem. The Chinese knew that 5,000 years ago. They actually said that a true physician checks people periodically to make sure they are not developing a problem, and if they are, to correct it, because they said it doesn't go away, it just goes deeper into the body and becomes more serious. So the true physician is going to prevent that from happening by keeping the body clean, correct, and balanced before it happens. And therefore, if he doesn't do that, in fact, in their system, it was at one time that if they were going to a physician periodically to be checked, and he did not keep them corrected, then they got sick, he treated them free. Now look what that would do to the medical system today if they had to treat you if what they did didn't keep you from getting sick. So prevention was a part of the system. In fact, the major portion of the system was to keep your body clean and in balance so that would not happen. So we have waited in our society, especially the pharmaceuticals, till you get some symptoms, and then they want to sell you some very expensive drugs to stop those symptoms, which really is the body trying to correct itself and knowing that in the future you're going to be back with something more serious and going to require even more expensive treatment, and many times having an organ in the body so destroyed that it might have to be surgically removed. And yet, we, the American public, have bought into this system thinking that all along medicine is doing them all these great favors and keeping them alive. And of course, they've used some distorted figures to make it sound like that we are. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into that, but if you remember, when they talk about living longer, what they aren't saying is, yes, we can show you that people are living longer. They're saying we have generated a mathematical formula, and it's a probability formula based on a set of variables, and with that formula we announce periodically that the average life expectancy is such and such years. Now, there were some studies done by a couple of researchers from Harvard several years ago called the vitality factor, and what they found is they went back 200 years and all of the records they could find of people when they were born and when they died. They established that the average lifespan, not the average life expectancy. Now, I don't know if that's clear to you or not, but the average life expectancy is a probability mathematical construct based on a series of variables, which means that certain things can skew it one way or the other, and if we remove that skewing, then it would not be telling you the story that they're trying to tell you, because they would find out that the average life, not the average life expectancy, but the average real life, the lifespan of the people that they were able to research, has been 85 since the last 200 years. That's how far back they could find the records. So people were living on the average 85 years old, and in a few cases they lived over 100, and in a few cases they died sooner, but on the average they were living to 85 years old. And so this concocted figure was skewed from the beginning, because we had this mammoth flu epidemic that took place back in the early 1900s, the great Spanish flu epidemic, where millions of people died, and that number of deaths were part of that figure, and so it skewed it way off, and the original numbers they came up with, that we were down in the high 50s or early 60s that our life expectancy could be. Now, the interesting thing about a mathematical formula of that nature is that every year that goes by past that skewing will gradually improve. So that means that if they did nothing, if they didn't give you one pill and you just recalculated every few years, it would look like you could expect to live longer. So that is a construct. It's a probability factor. It is not factual. And so everybody said, wow, look at that, medicine is helping people live longer. But that's not the case. People were living 85 on the average before any of that. And so in fact, there's some strong evidence that the reason a lot of people died from the Spanish flu was the treatment they received back then also, and we don't even have time to get into all the details of that, but the fact was that they were doing some things that actually turned off the immune system and allowed many people to die because they had no immune function. And it's been known for years that viruses have to have immune action to get rid of them, and taking of any pill isn't really going to do that. There is nothing on the market that really will keep or help your body deal with viruses. Even though they have some antiviral agents they are peddling at a very high price, they will not stop the virus from replicating to any degree, and they will spread in the body until the body's immune system takes over. I mentioned some time back about a book called The Body is a Hero, and that in that book, a very well-known, world-recognized immunologist just said that antibiotics have no effect on viruses or your body getting well. In fact, if anything, they create their own problems, that only the body can kick in the immune system and really get you well. So let's look a little bit more. He says the epicenter of this selling is, of course, the United States, home to many of the world's larger pharmaceutical companies. And he says that with less than 5% of the world's population, the U.S. already makes up almost 50% of the global market in prescription drugs. In other words, we only have 5% of the world population, but we consume 50% of the marketed prescription drugs. So then the book goes on to tell you how they have actually gotten major marketing companies to help them market disease that take some symptom and try to make it into, and it can be a symptom of everyday life, like stress and other things, and make that symptom into a disease and then market an extremely expensive patented drug to try to alleviate the symptoms, while at the same time the problem is still there, and if anything does progress and get worse, as the Chinese said, that the disease is never stagnant or never still, that it just keeps on progressing. So it's important that we know what's going on, and that it's also important that we make some decisions about our health. Now, those two statements are kind of the introduction to what we're talking about. But to really get to understand it, we need to look back some and this kind of understand how we got to where we are. Now, if you look at the history of medicine, you will find that back in the 1700s, it had gotten into a rather interesting state. They were doing things like bloodletting. They were doing trepanning, that if you had a bad headache, they would drill a hole through your skull to let out the vapors in your brain, and therefore to try to treat your headache. There was a lot of some very barbaric things actually going on at that time, and consequently there was a doctor trained in Germany, very learned doctor. He was learned not only in medicine, but he also was learned in languages and a lot of other things. When he looked at the way medicine was going at that point, he ended up deciding he wasn't going to work in it. He wasn't going to do the bloodletting, and he wasn't going to do all of the drilling of holes to let out the vapors to cure your headache, and all the things that were happening. And also they were writing prescriptions of very complex compounds and putting them together, and the pharmacies of the day, the drugstores, what we would call a drugstore, pharmacies, they were enjoying it because those prescriptions contained a lot of different compounds or elements, and they sold by weight, so those long complex prescriptions were making them a lot of money. So everybody was having a good time except the people who were sick. And so this doctor decided he wasn't going to participate, and he would make his living by translating medical books because he was proficient in at least 3 languages beside his native German. And so that's what he did. And as he was doing these translations, he ran into some statements that caused him to do a rethink of medicine, period. Now, his name was Christian Friedrich Samuel Hahnemann, a brilliant man of his time, and anybody who studies his work will realize that he was perceptive and was noticing things that was being ignored or totally misunderstood by the medical establishment. But already back then, they were trying to palliate or treat symptoms so people would feel better, but doing nothing to really make people well. And so as he translated these various medical works, he ran across one that was talking about how some of the drugs that they had developed at that time worked, and he disagreed with it. And in the process of his disagreement, he began to do some experimentation. And the experimentation that he did was that he actually noted that they were using the bark of a tree called the China bark, which was a bark that there was something in it called quinine that had a suppressive effect on the fevers and of some of the symptoms of malaria. And so he got this idea in his mind that maybe every substance had a picture, or what he called a symptom picture, and that there was the potential in using that substance in a very small dose that would actually aid the body in correcting the same type of symptoms that it would generate when you took it. Because when the people were taking the heavy doses of quinine, they were being poisoned by it, and it brought on other symptoms. But it did somehow reduce the symptoms of malaria. And out of all of that research, he finally came up with a different concept. And that concept led to the development of homeopathic medicine. Homeopathic medicine has a logic to it. It was he was capable of taking the information he gleaned and turning it into a scientific system that was reproducible, and that he standardized the preparation of this various substances they used. But there were some key factors that made it different than anything that was being done. Now, the principle goes way back and could be traced all the way back to Egypt, and the principle was that like cures like. And what he found was that if he took a substance and he learned what all the symptoms were, that if you took a lot of that substance, it would create in your body, and then you diluted it down to a very weak amount called the minimum effective dose, and took that it would help the body to correct whatever those symptoms that it was generating. Now, I need to emphasize at this point something we've emphasized before, but I want it to become ingrained in your mind that the symptoms were what the body was doing to try to correct itself. Now, there's always been toxins in the environment, there's always been bad food, there's always been a lot of things that people could pick up, including viruses. Now, he was one of the first people to recognize that there was things that were poison in nature that could pass from one person to another, and that person's body would then have to respond to that and would generate a set of symptoms. And so, as I say, he found out that each substance had its own symptom picture, and that if you weakened it down to a very small amount that was non-toxic to the body, and took it when the symptoms of that substance matched the person's symptoms going on in the body, that it would aid the body in correcting itself, which it did. And so he actually put all this information together and published it as a formal medical paper in 1795 to show that this system not only worked, but it was reproducible. And it's interesting to the people who work with homeopathics that even today, the same remedies do the same things in people that they did then. I mean, we talk about scientific medicine. How much more scientific can it be? That it's reproducible, and that it does follow a theory that the practicum of it actually proves. And so he came head to head with the other physicians of that day, and he was, of course, castricized, and they didn't like him because everywhere he was, the people he treated got better. And they didn't keep getting sick like their people were, because all they were doing were palliating symptoms, and what he was doing was actually aiding the body to take care of itself and to correct itself. And so he was years ahead, in fact, a couple of 100 years ahead of what was going on. Now, they didn't like him very well because he gave them a bad name. They would have people that they treated for years would go to Dr. Hahnemann, and in a matter of a few weeks, and sometimes sooner, they would be well again, and therefore they weren't coming back to be treated again. And that was very disturbing to them. So they went to the government and complained way back then. In the 1700s, they were going back in the early 1800s complaining that this guy's taking their business. And The pharmacist didn't like him very well because he wasn't writing the big prescriptions. He was only wanting microdoses. And so they didn't like him either. So between the pharmacist and the allopathic physicians, which is how the other group became known, everywhere he went in Germany, they went and made complaints to the government that he was infringing on their business. And the pharmacist said, well, he's making his own pharmacy, therefore he's interfering with our trade. But the fact was they didn't want to make what he would have prescribed and was prescribing because it was not profitable. They were only need a micro amount, which meant they couldn't charge much. And so he bounced around over Germany until he came to one city, and the mayor of the city, his wife had been sick for years and treated by regular medicine for years, and no one could really get her well. Somebody referred her to Hahnemann. He treated her and he got well. Then, of course, the medical practitioners and the pharmacies went before this mayor and said, you've got to get rid of this guy, he's infringing on our business. And he said, look, he got my wife well after all these years that you've treated her, and she didn't get well, he got her well. Leave him alone. And so he was able to stay there for a long time, but up to that point they chased him out of various cities because he was interfering with their business. And he remained in Germany for many, many years until finally, in his latter life, he relocated to Paris, France, and took the whole concept of homeopathic medicine to France. And from France it spread on, went into England and all throughout Europe, and eventually it spread to the US. And so by the early 1800s it was working very well in this country. And so as time went on and the profession grew, there were doctors trained in the system, and there were medical schools who actually trained those physicians to work as a homeopathic physician, and there were hospitals established. From what I can find out, at one point there was approximately 40 homeopathic medical schools throughout the United States and about 100 homeopathic hospitals. And I had an occasion to talk to someone who worked in the last of the homeopathic hospitals, because the medical people in this country became very disturbed to the point that they went out and got the government involved to go investigate all these schools and make sure they were up to some standard, and it became known as the Flexner Report. And of course it got padded, and the conclusion they came to, of course, which was falsified figures, the same as is being done today with the pharmaceuticals in many cases, and we'll be talking some about that. They, bit by bit, either got the schools closed down, or eventually they took them over themselves to teach what they were doing. But the interesting part of it all was, if you go back historically throughout the 1800s, in this country, you will find that the bulk of educated people and people in professions and so forth all went to homeopathic medicine, including the old Rockefeller of the Rockefeller fame. He and his family were always treated by homeopathic medicine. Now, when it became apparent that there was some big money to be made in the pharmaceutical industry, he invested lots of money in stocks in the pharmaceuticals and made lots of money off of it, but he and his family took homeopathic treatment because he knew better. At any rate, it continued to grow until the high percentage of the people, as I say, were going to homeopathic medicine, and the allopaths were having a hard time making a living, and so they didn't like that too well. So they began a smear campaign to try to discredit homeopathy to the public. And in the latter 1800s, it got worse, and by the early 1900s, it got to the point that they were beginning to get more successful at it, and eventually almost totally obliterated it in this country. There was one school left after all those years that was operating, called, after Dr. Hahnemann, the Hahnemann Medical College in Philadelphia. And I had an occasion to have a patient who actually was a nurse in the Hahnemann Hospital in Philadelphia, where they were doing homeopathic medicine. And the medical school there gave a degree, a medical degree, but it was training in homeopathic medicine. Now, at some point, the pharmaceuticals were trying to figure how to get rid of that last school, and so they offered lots of money if the school would put in some courses of regular drugs. Now, they said to the school, we know your doctors are not going to actually prescribe them, but we think they ought to be familiar with them, and we're willing to give you a large amount of money if you will have some courses presented to the medical students about the allopathic approach, the standard drug approach. And so that went on for a while, and then the school decided, well, you know, what we really ought to do is put out two medical degrees. We're going to give one degree that would be an MD, and that would be the regular degree for the regular drug interests, and the second degree would be an HMD, which is a homeopathic medical doctor. So when a student came to that college, they could choose which it is that they would rather have, the homeopathic medical degree or the allopathic degree, the MD. Excuse me, the hospital still, of course, was doing homeopathic therapy. So, this nurse that worked there said that as time went on, the pressure grew to put in allopathic drugs. And so while she was a nurse, she said one day she went home and the pharmacy of the hospital had rows of homeopathic preparations and a homeopathic pharmacist that dispensed them in the hospital. And when she came in the next day, he was gone. All of the homeopathics were gone, and they'd been replaced by a new pharmacist that was dispensing the allopathic drugs. So they took over the hospital. And then shortly after that, they did away with the homeopathic medical degree. So the last bastion of homeopathic medicine, as far as it being taught and practiced on a large scale, was obliterated in one swift move. And now, of course, today, Hahnemann Medical College still stands in Philadelphia, but they're pumping out doctors with the standard medical practice of dispensing pharmaceutical drugs. So what happened is you had this division that was going, and an attorney that I know, his name is Harris Coulter, whose wife is an MD, who realized that what she was doing was not getting people well, quit doing regular medicine and learned homeopathic medicine and began to practice it. It caught his interest, what she was doing, because he saw the results she was getting with people and getting them well. Not managing their symptoms and not having them take a drug for the rest of their life at a high cost, but they were getting well. And so he became so interested, and he tracked the whole history of the homeopathic medical movement and the allopathic medical movement, and has, at this point, I think, published 4 books. I know of 4, unless he's done a 5th. And he called the series The Divided Legacy. And what he did is he tracked the history of these 2 different systems. And it's quite interesting as to how this all developed. And I've known him for quite some time. In fact, he taught, in one of the programs I studied in here in Florida, he taught the history of medicine, and especially the divided legacy between allopathy and regular medicine. Now, most people may not be aware of it, and unless they have changed it recently, the Florida State Medical Act says that if you're going to get a license as a doctor of medicine in Florida, you have to be a graduate of an allopathic medical school. So the term allopathic was in there, and as I say, unless they've removed it recently, it was in there. And so consequently, there were many practicing homeopathic doctors in Florida, but in keeping with the deception and the subterfuge that the regular medical establishment has developed, as Benjamin Rush warned about way back in the 1700s, 200 years before, bit by bit, they convinced the Homeopathic Medical Board, which existed in Florida. So at one point there was an allopathic, there was a homeopathic, there was an osteopathic, there was an eclectic medical board. Those were all different medical boards. And so what happened is the medical allopaths convinced the eclectic doctors, which basically was a type of medicine that utilized a lot of things, a lot of herbs, a lot of homeopathics, and diet, nutrition, all kinds of things. They convinced the state and these other boards to converge into one single board called a composite medical board. But of course, interestingly, there were several allopathic doctors on the board and only one representative of eclectic medicine and only one representative of homeopathic medicine. Now, at some point, there were still a lot of practicing homeopathic doctors, and they allowed them to continue in practice for a while, and then gradually they began to put pressure on them to quit doing homeopathy and to go with the allopathic drugs. And of course they did the same thing to the eclectic doctors. I knew one doctor, her name was Dr. Ruth Rogers, actually on the coast of in Central Florida, and she refused to give up her homeopathic. I knew one in Orlando, both of those are now dead. I knew one in Orlando that he kind of walked with his foot in both sides. He primarily was a homeopath, but he did not advertise himself as such, and he did a lot of homeopathy, but he started prescribing some drugs because after a while it became necessary, if you're going to maintain a medical license, you had to prescribe drugs. So Ruth Rogers fought them right down until she died and refused to ever give any of the allopathic drugs, the ones produced by the pharmaceuticals, and she continued to get people well utilizing homeopathic medicine. She actually had become well recognized in the homeopathic medical community. Now, most people have probably heard of homeopathy now, but depending on who you ask, you get everything from, wow, that's great, it's really good, it's a good way to be treated non-toxically and to get well, to, oh, that's a bunch of hogwash, there's nothing to it, there's no way that that micro amount of substance could have any great effect. And so we find that, as I say, there was this division going, and they almost succeeded in wiping homeopathic medicine out, because when they took over the last school and the last hospital, it was no longer easy for someone to be trained in homeopathy. There were some organizations that kind of kept it alive, and some doctors, like Dr. Rogers and another doctor, in fact, he was here in Central Florida, Dr. Shipman was his name, I knew him personally. Once they died, that pretty much was the end of the old line of homeopathic doctors. But anyhow, it's still, there is not actually a regular homeopathic medical school. There are some, as I say, organizations of homeopathic doctors who have set up training programs for people who want to learn about it, and there's the National Center of Homeopathy, which is a national organization that a lot of the doctors who utilize homeopathy belong to, but it still does not have its own medical school. And even though around the world it's practiced heavily, they never did discard it. In Germany, it's been practiced continuously since the time of Dr. Hahnemann. And in France, it's still there too. However, the medical doctors, the allopathic doctors, took control of it, and only allopathic medical doctors can do homeopathic medicine, whereas in Germany there's heilpraktikers, which are natural doctors who use homeopathy as well as the regular doctors. It's utilized in Switzerland, and it's utilized in Belgium and Switzerland, just all over, Austria. There's doctors who work with it heavily in Europe, but in this country, it has started a comeback. and it's inexpensive comparative-wise, and you don't go on a drug from homeopathy to take the rest of your life, and there's no adverse effects. And so consequently, because it's not big money, it's still discouraged as much as possible. And so if you're going to be a regular medical doctor, sometimes they don't bother them if they don't get too well known, but I've known some medical doctors who went more heavily into homeopathy that ended up having problems with the medical board, and in a few cases I know that they've lost their license. So it's still, this whole thing is going on, which I feel could really get rid of the big costs because of the fact the medical drugs are extremely expensive, they are patented, and the drug companies make huge profits on them, and they have all kinds of terrible adverse effects, including death. In fact, once we get into this more, you'll find out just how bad it is. The public has been so inundated by their ads and so forth, which incidentally, as far as I can find out, the United States is the only place that they publicly advertise prescription drugs like they do here, which they pre-sell to the public by everyday advertising. In fact, when you look at the TV, you see that the bulk of the ads are either pharmaceuticals of various sorts or attorneys offering to represent people who have been damaged by various drugs. Every month they have to pull drugs from the market. Every month there's new drugs put in, but on the average there's about 15 to 18,000 allopathic drugs circulating, and the drug companies want everyone, including healthy people, to be on 5 to 25 for their whole life. Now that to me is, that's why I described it as a giant dragon with an endless appetite. They want to pull everybody in and get everybody on drugs, and they have gotten, with the money they have to get into the legislators and donate huge amounts of money for their PAC funds, they do not want to do anything against them, and they, in my mind, are putting the health of this country at risk because it keeps them in office by the big donations. Now, the homeopathic manufacturers don't make that kind of profit, and they can't patent homeopathics because they're generic in nature. So we have a situation where there is a treatment out that could enhance your health, not suppress it, and instead of leading to chronic degenerative diseases, could actually make people healthy if one other factor were in operation and was knowledgeable. There aren't too many people who are aware of the nutritional issue, other than the fact they talk about nutrition, and we have nutritionists, but I want to introduce you to something else that came about in the 1930s. And knowledge of this is extremely important, so if you really want to know the core of the health problem, this is so important that I advise you to get online and get yourself a copy of this report that I'm going to talk about. Now, eventually it was discovered that there were such things as vitamins and minerals in the soil that were present in food that were necessary to the body. In fact, the word vitamin was developed by one of the early researchers when they isolated these factors called vitamins, and it came from the term vital amines. In other words, the researchers realized that these were vital to your health and that they had kind of amine bases, which is a type of chemistry, and so they called them vital amines, and it became abbreviated into the term vitamin. But also it was minerals. The minerals that are in the soil, or supposed to be in the soil, that should be in the food, and that those are extremely important. Now, it's interesting because the French have known that for a long time. I have a book in my library called Soil, Grass, and Cancer. And they talk about the fact that if you have soil that's depleted of certain minerals, it produces grass that's deficient in those minerals. And when animals eat those grasses that are deficient in minerals, the animal becomes deficient in those minerals, and certain ones missing lead to cancer. And so they've known that for years. This book was published a long time ago. A big study was done in France. In this country, there are some doctors who have known about it, but you don't ever hear about it. And so in the 30s, it's when more and more of this information started becoming available. And there were some doctors, actually, that got involved, and they were wondering why the health was deteriorating in this country. And so what they did is, the Department of Agriculture did some studies in the 30s of the nutrients in food grown on the soils in this country, and found that they were deficient in all kinds of nutrients, and especially the minerals. And so some of the doctors looking into this began to realize that if you're eating food that is deficient in certain nutrients, especially certain key minerals, that all kinds of health problems can develop. Now, they really weren't ahead of their time. They were behind because out of England, way back a long time before that, they found out that men who went out on sailing vessels and ate garbage, pretty much. They ate dried meats, salted meats, and so forth, but they had no fresh fruits or vegetables, that they developed certain types of illnesses. And that eventually became known as deficiency diseases. And so vitamin C and some of the B vitamins and so forth, they began to realize that if they were deficient in those, they would develop severe problems, both mental and physical. And so it eventually ended up, scurvy was one of the biggies, and that the sailing help would develop out on the ocean for weeks at a time, and sometimes months. And so they started adding limes to take with them to get the vitamin C, and they became nicknamed limeys, the sailors did, on those British sailing ships. And when they started eating the limes along the way, there was no more scurvy. So that was one of the early realizations of nutrients and what kind of terrible problems can develop from deficiencies. They also had discovered with rice that they peeled off all the nutrients, leaving just the plain white rice, and then the people were eating the white rice, that it was a major part of their diet, started to developing B vitamin deficiencies, and those only were corrected by either supplementing or getting good rice that had all the nutrients still there, the brown rice, instead of just plain white rice that had all the nutrients peeled off of it. It looked pretty, made a nice looking dish, but it had very little nutritional value. And of course it still goes today. I think people think if they eat white rice they're doing something good for themselves, but it's deficient in all the minerals and nutrients that were in it. Basically some carbohydrates, and there's not a whole lot left by the time they're finished with it. So at any rate, there were doctors that began to realize this. Now again, I say this is in the 30s, and they actually found the Department of Agriculture started running tests on the food grown in the soils in this country, and they found out that the foods were way down, and in fact, in many cases, totally deficient in a lot of key minerals like calcium and magnesium and iodine and iron and copper, which are all extremely important to have good health. And so some writer got to looking into this, and he wrote a big article which was published in 1936 in the Cosmopolitan magazine, and the name of the article was Modern Miracle Men. And his name was Rex Beach. You can get a copy, at least I still can find a copy on the internet of this article, because what happened is that a gentleman who was knowledgeable in all of this decided, his name was Mr. Fletcher, he decided to go before the U.S. Congress and read this article to them, and they were so impressed with the article that they actually had it printed up by the government printing press. I don't think you can get it directly from them, but there are still copies of it out on the internet, and as I say, I was able to pull one off. And The name of the article is Modern Miracle Men, and it's about a doctor by the name of Charles Northern, and it says, Dr. Charles Northern builds health from the ground up. Now what happened is that he began to realize that these deficiencies were in the soil, and therefore the food grown in the soil was missing all these nutrients. Now from the eye, a carrot looked like a carrot, but he found that some carrots had some minerals and some had none. But when you looked at it, it still looked like a carrot. And so people eating carrots thought they were doing something worthwhile for themselves, when in fact, a lot of the nutrients were missing. Now I'm going to just rapidly read you a few comments, excuse me, from this article. And then if you're really interested in your health, it would be worthwhile to find it and read it. Okay, here's what the writer says. This quiet, unballyhooed pioneer and genius in the field of nutrition demonstrates that countless human ills stem from the fact that impoverished soil of America no longer provides plant foods with the mineral elements essential to human nourishment and health. To overcome this alarming condition, he doctors sick soil, and by seeming miracles raises truly healthy and health-giving fruits and vegetables. And then the writer goes on to say, did you know that most of us today are suffering from certain dangerous diet deficiencies which cannot be remedied until the depleted soils from which our foods come are brought into proper mineral balance? The alarming fact is that foods, fruits, and vegetables and grains now being raised on millions of acres of land that no longer contain enough certain needed minerals are starving us, no matter how much of them we eat. This talk about minerals is novel and quite startling. In fact, a realization of the importance of minerals in food is so new that the textbooks on nutritional dietetics contain very little about it. Now, this was 1936. Nevertheless, it is something that concerns all of us, and the farther we delve into it, the more startling it becomes. The laboratory tests prove that the fruits, the vegetables, the grains, the eggs, and even the milk and meats of today are not what they were a few generations ago, which doubtless explains why our forefathers thrived on a selection of foods that would starve us. No man of today can eat enough fruits and vegetables to supply his system with the mineral salts he requires for perfect health, because his stomach isn't big enough to hold them. And we are running to big stomachs. It is bad news to learn from our leading authorities that 99% of the American people are deficient in these minerals, and that a marked deficiency in any one of the more important minerals actually results in diseases. Now, if deficiency results in diseases, then what are drugs going to do to cure the disease? Of course they're not. What do the drugs do? Remember, you've got to get it straight in your head. If you learn nothing out of what I have to say, drugs don't cure anything. Drugs turn off symptoms in the body by shutting down systems in the body to make it happen. Now what happens is, of course you feel better, but your body is sicker. And if you have no symptoms, which means you have no immune response, you can feel great until you drop dead, but you are not healthy. I hope that if I can impress anything on you, how important. Now this is 1936, the soil was depleted. Imagine what it is today when we grow many more thousands of tons of produce and food products on soil that was depleted back in 1936. That means that there's nothing there. You're eating empty food. You're eating fiber, and if anybody who's bitten into an apple or a nectarine or a peach and felt like all they had was like some coarse fiber and a little coloring but no sweet flavor of the fruit, that is fruit growing on depleted soil. And the second thing I want to impress is that if you eat something that says that it was grown organically, organically means the process by which it's grown, which means that they did not use pesticides and they did not use artificial fertilizers. If the minerals are not present in the soil, they will not be in that fruit or vegetable, no matter how organic it is. The only thing you're not getting are the pesticides and the chemical fertilizers, but you're certainly not getting any nutrition. And if you don't get nutrition, you're going to get sick. And if you get sick, you're going to have symptoms. And if you take a drug to suppress that symptom, you are not well. You're still sick, you just don't know how sick you are. And so that is basically a key factor that we need to emphasize as a part of this whole thing, because that's part of the great lie. The pharmaceuticals knew all this, they've known it for years. But they're not going to tell you that. In fact, I remember when they poo-pooed everybody for taking vitamins. They said you're wasting your money, you're going to be creating expensive urine, but it's not going to be of any benefit. You need real drugs, you need real medicine to treat you. Now, if you look at what's happened with all this true medicine and real medicine, are we healthier in this country than before? Of course not. And there's no one that could argue that there's less chronic disease today than ever, that there's less cancer than ever, and that there's less neurological degenerative diseases. Now, I don't have time to read you, but I'm going to read you the next broadcast a few excerpts about the things that they found just from calcium alone of kids that were deficient. They couldn't focus and concentrate, so what did they do? They punished the kid thinking that they were just not paying attention, and now what do? They want to give them some drug that distorts the brain so that you don't notice that they have a problem, which is a mineral deficiency. So we're going to get into that, and I hope that this makes sense, and this is why this is so important. If you want to reduce the tremendous health bill into the $1 trillion now per year in this country, you're not going to do it by producing more miracle drugs, because the drugs aren't miracles. In fact, it's a miracle that we're alive taking the drugs. Anyhow, I hope that I've gotten you started thinking, and I'm going to give you more references next time. There's a lot of books out there, a lot of investigators, but you never see those books on the best-selling list, and you don't see them being talked about on TV, on all the talk shows, or not even on Oprah's show. You don't see them talking about all this heavy nutritional stuff that you should be knowing. And you know, back a few years ago, at 1966, the Department of Agriculture found that we had even less in the soil than we had in the 30s, and just recently they started running a few more tests, and now we are on the average 50% less than we were in the 60s, which was already deficient from the 30s, and it was deficient in the 30s. Do we wonder why we have a terrible health problem in this country? It's not because of a scarcity of drugs, and it's not because getting more money to buy more of these drugs is going to get us better. Now, as I say, the pharmaceuticals knew this, but they discouraged people from taking supplements, because that's about the only way you can get any nutrients if it's not in the food and in the soil. And so what are they doing? They discouraged it, but when the public decided they were feeling better taking the supplements, what did the drug companies do? They come back out and start manufacturing a cheap synthetic form of vitamin and selling to the public like, sure, yeah, we know, everybody knows you should take vitamins, because they didn't want to lose that market. So they make a cheap synthetic vitamin, sell it to you, and let you think you're getting some kind of great vitamin combination, and what you're doing is getting a cheap substitute at a very expensive price. So I think we're getting down to about the end of the broadcast. So next time we're going to start off again with this, and then we're going to follow it a little farther and give you an idea of how you've been conned, and how you have been deceived, and how they have been caught in those deceptions, and what happens. They get a little slap on the hand and they continue to do the same thing over and over. Anyhow, it was nice being with you, and if you disagree with this, it's fine, but I think if I were in your position, I would be wanting to look into this just a little bit, because we're not getting healthier, and there's no way we can afford this outlandish sick bill that we get every year from the pharmaceuticals for all the new patent drugs. They patent them, and they can charge whatever they want for them, and if a few people die, well, so what? We put it in the price of the drug, so it doesn't cost us anything. And the people have been conned into buying all this, and don't seem to notice that everybody's getting sicker. So, from mindyourhealthcast.com, I hope we've gotten your attention, and we'll try to actually give you a lot more information the next round.